Purdue Pharma laid off its entire sales team this week, now only on CBS This Morning. A former Purdue sales rep claims the drug maker downplayed the dangers of opioids even after pleading guilty to a felony charge of misbranding. Purdue's 2007 settlement with the Justice Department included more than $630 million in fines. But 24 states and more than 400 cities and counties are suing Purdue and its competitors, accusing them of fueling an opioid drug crisis that's killed more than 200,000 people.
That was audio from CBS This Morning from June 21st, 2018, after Purdue Pharma laid off its entire sales team. And you hear the allegations John Dickerson is reading there, and they sound bad, right? But there's a lot of things we don't really know. And coming into this, as someone like the majority of the country is, who is relatively uninformed about the opioid crisis, or if you're from regions that are particularly hard hit, you know too much. But if you're coming into this whole situation relatively uninformed, and you see stories like this in the news, and you're like, Purdue Pharma, whoa, this sounds bad. What did they do? Like, how did it get to this point? This is what we're going to explore tonight. Tonight on Spotlight, we explore the rise and current effects of the opioid crisis. A crisis that killed more than 200,000 people and is one of the worst public health crises in this country today. Began with 3 brothers and 1 company, and some very misleading branding. Tonight on Spotlight, we uncover how this deadly rise of the so-called miracle drug Oxycontin, derived to help kill pain in a long-lasting fashion, grew into a nightmare that killed so many people. That's tonight on Spotlight. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spenser Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And I want to start by going all the way back today. And we're going to be using a lot of audio for this podcast. And if you don't know, this is a reporter by the name of Barry Meyer. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the New York Times who really uncovered this whole entire situation, this trickery Purdue was playing.
There were 3 Sackler brothers. There was Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond. They all grew up in New York City. They were from Brooklyn. Their parents were immigrants, and they all eventually went to medical school and were trained as research psychiatrists.
The Sackler brothers. You're going to hear a lot more about what them and their predecessors in the position, their descendants, have caused. And they've caused a lot of trouble, to say the least.
Arthur, the older brother, even while he was in medical training, worked part-time as a copywriter.
This is Barry Meyer, by the way, the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who exposed the whole opioid situation, talking to Michael Barbaro on the New York Times podcast, The Daily.
In an advertising company that specialized in advertising prescription drugs.
Arthur was a very talented marketer, and he had a lot of experience in both the mental, psychological field and the medicinal field, which really came into play. This experience really came into play later on.
And right around this time, which was not long after the end of World War II, the pharmaceutical industry itself was exploding. Companies were growing. They were producing more types of drugs, lots of different antibiotics, for example. And Arthur discovered he's got a real knack for this. One of the more infamous ads that he created was an ad for an antibiotic. And it was essentially a testimonial where you had doctors testifying about what a great drug it was. And subsequently, when people started checking on the whereabouts of these doctors, they found out that these doctors didn't exist.
He just made them up.
He totally made them up.
And one of the things he realized from that whole entire exchange is that doctors, unsurprisingly, there are medical health professionals, they have a lot of credibility with a lot of people. They see people who have a white lab coat, see people standing with like a stethoscope around their neck, and they know that these people, what they tell me is gospel, and they know what they're talking about. They should not be taken as fools. They've gone through medical school, they've had a lot of experience in the field, and they know what they're doing. And you're going to find out he really took advantage of this simple disparity and observation.
But it became sort of a hallmark. This is the kind of stuff that Arthur Sackler did. Arthur is making a fortune from the advertising and marketing of drugs. But there's one area where he wants to make another fortune, and that is in the production and sale of drugs themselves. Mm-hmm. So he brings in his brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, and they purchase a company that becomes known as Purdue Pharma.
So they buy this company, all the brothers, Arthur, Raymond, Mortimer, Sackler. They buy this company called Purdue Pharma. It was a very small company at the time, and they were making some pretty small, laughable drugs. One of them was an earwax softener, and one of them was a laxative. I mean, they were really weird drugs. They were drugs that people like grandparents only really needed to use, or people who had Crohn's colitis or whatever. And they were relatively helpful drugs, but they weren't really quite doing it for the Sacklers. I mean, they're very entrepreneurial people. They are. They're very. Once they kind of get the taste of money, as with most people, it's pretty hard to get away from.
It's in the 1980s that they start selling their first real drug. It's a drug that is supposed to treat the most severe types of pain, like cancer pain, called MS-Contin. And essentially what it is, it's pure morphine in a tablet form.
Barry, how did the company go from earwax remover to pure morphine? That's a huge leap.
Well, the Sacklers were adept at catching moments, and the 1980s was one of them, particularly when it came to the treatment of pain.
What Barry Meyer was talking about there in that equation was a lot of times, and perhaps very smartly so, people before the 1980s were very reluctant to use narcotics to treat pain, and they felt very uncomfortable with it. But as he will go on to explain here, there were some significant changes that these Sackler brothers, when they purchased Purdue and then began to stop making these relatively minor drugs like earwax softeners and laxatives, they began to realize there was a lot more possibly that could be at stake than just this. When people started to realize that it was more important to be compassionate, when they started to believe that it was more important to be compassionate than safe, when it came to this cancer-treating drug that was pretty much pure morphine, then the Sacklers really started to realize this could get good.
For years, there had been resistance to the use of narcotics to treat pain, even for patients who were suffering from cancer or who were at the end of their lives. There was, fears of addiction, that these patients would abuse the drug.
A special documentary report on the topic of cancer pain.
But by the 1980s,
cancer patients sometimes suffer needless pain. They suffer not because pain relief is impossible, but because we are sometimes more focused on that elusive cure than on compassion.
People wanted to be compassionate.
People just seemed to really want to focus on one thing, and that was really to cure cancer and not really focus on too much else in terms of the safety, because that was kind of at the time in the medical community when cancer just started to feel even more overwhelming and kind of out of reach as a whole. So that's kind of how that whole situation began. and very disturbingly so. Things soon spiraled out of hand, with the compassion overdrive being kind of taken advantage of by the stackers once they saw the possible opportunity for business there, and how much this cancer drug that they did produce was getting to be pretty popular. So here is Barry Meyer describing the need for compassion, and then how the production of this drug got a little too far.
People wanted to deal with this type of patient pain. And MS-Contin, which was a long-acting form of morphine that started producing, kind of arrived at this moment. And doctors embraced it as an effective way of treating patients at the end of life. That compassionate approach to pain treatment soon jumped over the walls of the cancer wards into the mainstream of medicine. As advocates for greater narcotics use began promoting the use of these drugs for all kinds of common pain, be it back pain, arthritis, dental pain, you name it, basically pointing back to the experience with cancer patients, saying, it was so successful here, why are we preventing patients from getting these kinds of drugs?
And it would seem that Purdue Pharma would be well positioned for that.
They were perfectly positioned, because right around the time that this movement was making the transition from the cancer ward into the general breadbasket of medicine, they were developing a drug that would become the flagship drug of the pain management movement.
And I'm sure you can guess what drug that was. You guessed it. It was OxyContin. That is one of the opioid families of drugs. It's one of the most, as you know, it's one of the most powerful, deadly drugs that so many people suffer from today. And I just wanted to do really quickly give you kind of a view about how much this is affecting everyone today. Every day, more than 115 people in the United States die after overdosing on opioids. The misuse of and addiction to opioids, including prescription pain relievers, heroin, synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, is a serious national crisis that affects public health as well as social and economic welfare, as we've seen in many states, especially in the Rust Belt, and states and places like New Hampshire that have been very severely hard hit. The Centers for Disease Control and Protection estimates that the total economic burden of prescription opioid misuse alone in the United States costs $78.5 billion a year, including the cost of healthcare, lost productivity, addiction treatment, and criminal justice involvement. In the late 1990s, pharmaceutical companies reassured the medical community that patients would not become addicted to prescription pain opioid relievers, and healthcare providers began to prescribe them at greater rates. This is how we know that this is the story that we are really trying to explore today. Here's what we know, though. Roughly 21 to 29% of patients prescribed opioids for chronic pain misuse them. Prescribed opioids for chronic pain misuse them. Between 8 and 12% develop an opioid use disorder, and an estimated 4 to 6% who misuse prescription opioids can transition to heroin. About 80% of people who use heroin first misuse prescription opioids, and opioid overdoses increased 30% from July 2016 through September 2017 in 52 areas in 45 states. The Midwestern region saw opioid overdoses increase 70% from July 2016 through September 2017, and opioid overdoses in large cities also increased 54% in 16 states. So it's a big deal, and it's really kind of, I know I've kind of been singling out the Midwest for a lot of this episode, and it's not really fair because it has, as we can see from these statistics from drugabuse.gov, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the government website on that, that is very helpful and provides kind of stats for this. It really is a big problem. I do really want to give you a sense of how big this is getting, as this new drug, OxyContin, first came onto the market as Barry Meyer, that is, my apologies. Barry Meyer walks us through how this opioid situation, this OxyContin situation,